about the pot calling the kettle black. Morning Joe, as I predicted, has already started to change their show. Now, what did we tell you? After the election, they saw a significant decrease in ratings. Next thing you know, they're on their way to Mar-a-Lago to dine with Donald Trump and say, we're going to try to communicate better and cover him in a more favorable light, right? That's because of those ratings. That's why. And now we're starting to see, now apparently it's okay for Morning Joe to call out the billionaire class. But I want to remind you, when leftists, and I mean real leftists, and some progressives were calling out the billionaires, were calling out corporations and corporate greed, it was people like Mika and Joe that were smearing us as far left, radical, crazy, loony people, commies, and all this types of stuff. So do we get to do that to them as well? Shout out to Case Study QB for this one, guys. Really interesting. I told you they're already starting to change the way they do the show. Listen to this.
Here's the thing, though, Kurt. I am a capitalist. I am a proud capitalist, but I am a proud capitalist with guardrails that capitalism used to have. And
pause. Why do you need to say you're a proud capitalist? He said, I'm a capitalist and I'm a proud capitalist. Why do you have to add the proud? Who are you trying to convince? Capitalism with guardrails, we are going to debunk, because that is not such a thing. If you had capitalism with guardrails, you wouldn't have poor people. You have poor people because we have capitalism. So this whole idea of no, capitalism doesn't need to disappear. We can still have capitalism, but we'll just put guardrails on it. That means people will still be at the bottom. And I just want everybody to understand what that really means. And I know all of you, not everyone that watches is a socialist or whatever, or a Marxist. And I totally get that. But I do want to push back on some of these things for people to understand. And it rubs me the wrong way when people say capitalism with guardrails. Those guardrails may help a few, but those guardrails don't prevent poverty. So you have to understand that with capitalism to exist, that means that there is some form of exploitation. Capitalism with guardrails would not remove billionaires, right? It would not remove trillionaires. It would just make things a little bit more leveled, but you would still have poverty.
And I understand people don't want to talk about income redistribution. I'm not a big fan of income redistribution. And I'm especially not a big fan when the income is being moved from middle-class Americans to billionaires. And that has been happening for 3 decades.
Now, all of a sudden, he cares about people losing their money. Now, all of a sudden, they're complaining about the billionaires. So does everybody see the shift that this show was taking? So now they're trying to appeal more to working class viewers. Look, come on. They didn't just discover this yesterday. This is them trying to expand their audience, hopefully get those ratings back up. And they heard the message that the Democratic Party basically lost the working class. So this is what they're trying to do. Again, these people are actors. They are not journalists. They're actors. When they say infotainment, right? But he still mentions the middle class. I don't like middle class money being moved to billionaires. It always stops right there, because they never go to lower income. They never mention poor. They never mention working poor. There are people below the middle class, a lot of people below the middle class. There's hardly any middle class left in this country. So who are you talking about? You're talking about a select group of people. What about all those people that are working poor, that are lower income, and that are just poor, right? There are people in this country that are on disability to no fault of their own, and they receive a disability check, which is not much. And if you ever have known someone who's on disability, like 100% or permanent disability, and they've talked to you about what their disability check is, or if you had a family member, you know they don't receive much. What about those people? The people who legally can't work. They'll never talk about those people. They still talk about middle class as though we actually still have a real middle class in this country. I'm going to show you a chart after this clip, and you're going to see how small that so-called middle class has become over the years.
Ernest, I know you talk about Ronald Reagan a lot, but really it started with Democrats in the 90s, with the Rubin Democrats, when suddenly it was hard to tell the difference between Republicans and Democrats. And carried interest matters. The fact that billionaires just continue to get richer and richer, and they pay a lower tax rate than their clerical workers, that matters. And what I'm not talking about winning elections. I'm talking about rebuilding the middle class of America. So if gas prices go up 10, 15, 20%, whatever it may do over the next couple of years, they can afford it without wondering how they're going to pay for the groceries.
Yeah.
Oh, now all of a sudden you want to mention paying for the groceries after you told people, well, no, inflation is gone down. No, the groceries aren't that bad. Remember, they said this on this show. So you can tell they're not doing their own grocery shopping. Mika and Joe are probably able to walk into a store and not have to look at the price. How many people can do that? I bet you Mika can walk into a department store or walk into Bloomingdale's, or actually that might be low end for her. Give me another one. Nordstrom, is that higher end? Mika can probably walk into Nordstrom and pick out an outfit and not look at the price. We had to do a project when I was in undergrad, and we had to do a price study, and I'll never forget this. Anyway, we had to go to different stores and compare prices. I don't want to get into all the details of the project. It was kind of boring. But anyway, one of the stores that we went into was Nordstrom. I looked at a dress for a toddler dress, $500. Why does a child need a $500 dress? And more importantly, who the hell can afford to buy a $500 dress for a kid? Kids are still growing, right? So you're probably not going to have that dress for too long. So she can probably afford to do that. Joe can probably walk into, what are these stores you guys go to get your suits? Men's Warehouse. Oh, Gilbert said Neiman Marcus. Okay, you're right. That one's probably more expensive. Okay, wherever dudes go to get their suits and all that jazz, he can probably walk into a suit shop, a tailor, whatever you guys call them. I don't know, shit. But he can probably walk in and just pick out a suit and not look at the price, regardless how expensive it is. I don't know people that can't look at prices. If you're like me, you grew up looking at prices. So we know how much a gallon of milk cost. We know how much eggs cost. There may be some of you that at some point you may have been at the grocery store, you may have been at a retail store, and maybe, once you got in line and you start seeing those prices add up and tax add onto it, you realize you might not be able to afford everything. You may have had to put things back. Mika and Joe don't know that life. Mika and Joe come from privileged families, especially Mika. So just keep that in mind. So now all of a sudden they're trying to tell the same things that those of us that were progressive, socialist, all of us have been saying for years. Now all of a sudden they're saying the same thing because they're trying to get back that working class base.
Capitalism was working just fine from the end of World War II through the 70s. And that's because all the boats, more or less, were rising together as we prospered. That ended. And that ended because your former party, with the complicity of a lot of Democrats, concentrated on changing that. Now, Chris Murphy, the senator from Connecticut, had great interviews recently in which he says, as more than a diagnosis, as Daniel said, Democrats have to reverse what they've done, which is Democrats, Harris, all of them, spend 80% of their time with these kind of fine-tuned, wonky policy things. Well, I have a plan. Here's the plan. Well, and they're civil and they're pearl clutching Mitt Romney-esque in their style, which kind of can't go on. So instead of having 80% about your policy wonk details and 20% of like, hey, I'm angry. This is a kind of a rigged system. They should reverse that and do what Donald Trump does, but also make good on the deliverables of that, right? To be economic populists, real economic populists, which they have moved to, which they're becoming, but then with the message and the messengers that become the message, whether it's John Fetterman, whether it's Bernie Sanders, whether.
Pause. So now it's okay to promote economic populism. Now it's okay to talk about a living wage. Now it's okay to push that populist message after you guys shouted all of us down for years. And by the way, you can scratch John Fetterman off that damn list. John Fetterman is a cosplaying clown. John Fetterman did not grow up in a working class household. He's cosplaying. He also comes from a well-to-do family. This dude walks around in a hoodie, so he makes you believe that he grew up in like this blue collar family. He didn't. He didn't even have a blue collar job. He's a cosplayer. Stop. Now they're trying to add that to John Fetterman's message. This is their attempt, by the way. Pay attention. They've been trying to push John Fetterman's name for president for 2028. I'm not kidding. So this is their way of trying to elevate John Fetterman. Why would they do that? Number one, he's very, 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 very pro-Israel, says very disgusting things about Palestinians and about the protesters. So he's a straight up Zionist. He's great for the Israeli lobby. So that's someone they definitely want to advocate for. And then they're like, well, he wears a hoodie and he appears more like rough and gruff, and maybe he'll be the Democrats' Donald Trump. Look, Donald Trump may have a little bit of filter missing, right? So Donald Trump has a way of expressing how he feels to people without a filter. Some people just have no filter. But Donald Trump and John Fetterman are not the same people. But that's what they're trying to do. Follow this narrative. I'm not kidding. They are trying to elevate John Fetterman to be the Democrats' Donald Trump.
Whether it's Anthony Delgado, whether it's we could name them, Jared Golden in Maine, whatever. And if they're left or moderate, it doesn't matter if they can win by being and seeming, kind of walking the walk as well as talking the talk.
Okay, so let's take a look at something. This video was posted 12 years ago. So I'm going to show you 12 years ago, and then I'm going to show you today. This is what wealth inequality looks like in the United States. This was 12 years ago. This video was posted to YouTube. What wealth inequality looked like then. It was bad then. It's worse now.
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed.
Everyone look at that. So 12 years ago, the actual distribution of wealth, look at how much the top 20%, fourth, and then you'll see middle right here. So as you can see here, even 12 years ago, the middle class was that tiny. And then, of course, second, you can barely see. And then last is that the group that's at the bottom there. And I would argue even some of the people that think they're middle class today would be at the bottom.
Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind
That top 1% right here. And this is the group that I continue to say, again, the billionaire class. They are what is keeping the rest of us down. This, and I don't care. This is why I say, no, the guardrail thing missed me with that. Because the reality is, how in the hell did this even happen? People don't become billionaires because they worked hard. Some of them are billionaires because of inheritance. Let's be real. We did a whole show about this, that the majority of billionaires that are under the age of 30, I think it was 30, 35, they inherited it. So their wealth was inherited, right? But billionaires get their wealth by exploiting other people. You create billionaires, not you personally, but it is the workers that create the billionaires, because the workers do the work for the billionaires' companies. They receive less money, way less money than the CEOs. And of course, the person who owns the company. And that's how the billionaire is able to become a billionaire, because they have figured out a way that to make more money is to do less work myself, but to get other people to do the work for me. That includes some of your faves, by the way. That includes your Rihanna. That includes your Taylor Swift. They have found ways to exploit labor from other people, and that's how they become billionaires. They also get tax breaks from the U.S. government. The U.S. government works in their favor. They don't work in the favor of the working class. So these people are crushing everybody else.
blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right. Just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before, based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard.
Pause. This is something I got to debunk. This is a good video, but they get socialism incredibly wrong. Yes, socialism, the idea that we would all be on the same level, would all get the same. However, when he makes the comment and he says that, well, that won't work because we need to encourage people to work. Socialism doesn't mean that you don't have a job. Socialism doesn't mean that you're not working. And I don't know why people can't get this through their heads. People need to understand the true definition of socialism. Socialism means that the workers own the means of production. So let's get this through our heads. Maybe I need to put this on one of my merch t-shirts. Maybe I need to add that on one of my merch t-shirts, the definition of socialism and what it actually means. It means that you wouldn't produce work that you didn't own the means of production for. Right now, a lot of us have jobs and we produce the work, but we don't own anything. We don't own the company. We don't own the computer, the work computers that we're using. It belongs to them. We don't own any of the production. So there is a difference between not working and owning the means of production. So I had to debunk that. We're going to get on this show. We're going to get these things right. Let's continue.
Hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were.
But the poor, we shouldn't have the poverty at all in a country that's as wealthy as the United States. So notice how he says that kind of casually. Yeah, the poor at the bottom are starting to suffer a lot. But in a country as wealthy as the United States, we should not have poverty in this country at all. If you look at a country like China, which again is not perfect, we're very clear about that, is not perfect. They have found a way to almost eradicate poverty. So when you take care of your people, these are the types of things that can happen. You know, we can clean up homelessness in this country. We can give everybody housing. They're giving people housing in China. Like, it's just stuff like that. Again, China's not perfect, but there are some things that we can learn from them.
While the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America.
There it is.
The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change. And the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show.
10 times higher than they can show. So again, if you talk about someone like Elon Musk, for example, who has quite a bit of children, he has a lot of kids, right? His kids will inherit his wealth. They won't have to work for it. All of these billionaires who have children, their kids will inherit their wealth. So this is not okay. Regardless of what you believe, whether you're socialist or not socialist, there's no way in hell this should happen in a country as wealthy as the United States. So you see where a lot of the wealth has moved to. Now I show you that. And then I want to show you something else as well. Hold on one second here. I want to make sure. Okay. I don't know what that. Oh, it does start with that guy. Hold on. Let's see what happened here. Okay, here we go. So I want you to see what this gentleman said on MSNBC. This was just 2 weeks ago about the wealth disparity in the United States. 2 weeks ago.
Exit polling, the economy was one of the top issues on the minds of voters as they cast their ballots on Tuesday. Joining us now with charts is former Treasury official and Morning Joe economic analyst Steve Ratner. And Steve, you are looking at the metrics that fueled Trump's win. Let's start with the issue of income. What did the numbers tell you?
Yeah, of course, Mika, this is at the heart of the matter for almost every American. What is my purchasing power? How much can I buy? What's happening to my standard of living? And so let me show you what actually did happen over the last really decade or so.
So the video we just saw was 12 years ago. And this is what the wealth inequality is in 2024.
But if you go back to 2014, and these are all inflation adjusted incomes, this is what you have after inflation. Incomes rose fairly steadily at about a rate of 1.3% all the way through the Trump administration. Now, 1.3% may not sound like a big number, but that's after inflation. That's more money that you have to spend. Ignore this. This was a COVID distortion. During the Biden administration, you can see that they actually went down for a while. That was that big burst of inflation that we had. And that lately they've been coming back. And when all is said and done, they were basically flat for this period. And this bothers Americans. And they feel that it was even worse because they don't really see these numbers, this chart exactly, but they feel this and they don't quite feel this. And so they basically say inflation is what's hurting them. And in fact, incomes did not do as well in the Biden administration as in the Trump administration. We just have to put that out there.
Pause. Did you hear what he just said? Incomes did not do well under the Biden administration. Somebody finally said it on liberal media. Corporate liberal media. Isn't this what we were all saying? Haven't we been saying this since Joe Biden's presidency, since the beginning? Haven't we been saying this? See, now they have to admit it again because they lost all them viewers and they're trying to get these people come back. So now they got to admit this. This is what we were telling people.
So Steve, let's continue through the charts. So talk about the disconnect between how well America's economy is doing. We hear it all the time. America's envy of the world. Every world leader says they would love to change trade places with the United States. The U.S. dollar at an all-time are moving towards an all-time high.
Every world leader does not say they would like to trade places with the United States. Oh my God.
The stock market at an all-time high. S&P at an all-time high. Talk about the overall economy, and then this segment of the economy that you say for working class Americans that you think drove the election in Donald Trump's direction.
Sure, Joe. So, yes, as we've talked about on the show, I think as recently as last week, the American economy overall is doing fantastically well. The envy of the world, everything we've been talking about, growth, low unemployment, and inflation coming down. But let's talk about how it affects the average American. One of the big things that I believe is lurking behind the fact that you have this huge right track, wrong track, upside down poll numbers that we've all seen so much of is the American dream and the question of whether the American dream is still there. So let's just look at this one chart. If you go back to 1940, 90% of young Americans would, by the age of 30 rather, make more money than their parents did. That has come steadily down. Some of that is somewhat natural as we became more prosperous, but it just continues to go down and down and down and down. And now you're down here at 50%. So only 50% of American parents should believe or will find that their son or daughter is making as much or more as they're making at the age of 30. That's not the American dream. The American dream is obviously each generation is supposed to do better than the one before.
All right. And then your final.
So everybody sees this, right? From 1940, a little bit over 90%, all the way down to once you get past to today, just under a little bit under 50% in reference to the upward mobility for Americans. Wait till we get to millennials. Watch this.
Chart, Steve, is about industrial wages falling behind. Tell us about it.
Well, actually, Mika, before we do that, can I do my middle chart, which we didn't
do your middle chart? Which one?
Because it's in the same theme of what happens.
Okay.
So, and all the income inequality that we've had in this country over the last 20 years has led to some very different outcomes. If you're a white child born in the bottom 25th percentile, so now we're back to the famous white working class. If you were born in 1978 versus being born in 1992, on an inflation-adjusted basis, a child born in 1992 had 6% less income after inflation, all that, at the age of 30, than at the age of 27, rather, than a child born back here in 1978. So,
yes. So everybody, if you're in the chat and you were born in the 90s, raise your hand, raise your hand in the chat and say, let us know if you were born in the 90s. This is what we've been trying to tell people. Our parents had it better. Our grandparents had it a little bit better. And so as you can see over the years, see how it just continued to decline. And we got to mention what happens here in the 80s, right? Because a lot of this decline starts to happen during Reaganomics, right? Boom, 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 boom. Boom, boom, boom. Reaganomics. It was supposed to trickle down, honey, but it did not.
So children are in this cohort of a white working class are making less and less and less each birth year that they have. In contrast, for the people at the top, they've actually been making a bit more for each child born. So you have this situation where children of white working class parents are making less each child year after year as they're born. They're completely the opposite at the top. So let's also compare millennials to baby boomers. I'm a baby.
Pause. We know you're a boom, but listen to this. What this means to you. And so for my white viewers, because this is something I was trying to stress to people. It's not just them. They're not just going to come after black folk. They're going to come after you too. A lot of these policies that were implemented to work against black people also ended up working against lower income white people. The reason why we don't have universal health care for everybody in this country, I played this video multiple times before, is because they didn't want black people to have health care. That also affects poor white people. Same thing with Social Security. So if you are white working class, let's say you came from a blue collar household, the chances that you are likely to establish wealth is relatively low. The chances are higher if you are a child that is born from the 75th percentile. It's higher for you. So if you're born in poverty, it's going to be harder. And that's why I say it's hard to break a cycle of poverty. When you are born poor, it is harder to get out of poverty. So we got to remember that.
Boomer, and see what their different situation is. So if you talk about home ownership, baby boomers, 62% of baby boomers owned a home. 49% of millennials owned a home at the same age of 35. So millennials worse off. If you look at negative net worth, i.e. being bankrupt, 14% of millennials are bankrupt by the age of 35. Only 9% of boomers were.
So what did I tell you? I'm a millennial here, millennial in the house. I told you we had it rough. And the generation behind me is having it worse. Like Gen Z's having a harder time than even harder time than millennials. But I told you we have it rough. We're more likely, look at this, when compared to our parents' generation. My parents are boomies, right? So a 14% bankruptcy rate compared to boomers. And then I just want to show this one more time here with housing, home ownership, right? 62% boomers, 49% millennials. So this is what I was trying to explain to people. This is why I say it's not all about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, because the reality is, as we go through the years, you continue to see where wages didn't adjust for inflation or for housing crashes like we had in 2008. The wages didn't adjust, but the prices continue to increase, and home prices increase, and rent continued to increase. So this is important for people to see when people say, oh, just get off your butt and just get a job. People are working. But the prices and the wages don't add up, bud.
By the age of 35, only 9% of boomers were. If you look at wealth, millennials have on average 30% less wealth than baby boomers had at the same point in their life. But the top 10% of millennials actually had more wealth than the baby boomers. So you have huge wealth inequality among millennials. So these are all reasons why people feel that the American dream isn't what it was supposed to be.
And listen, and I'll say this, regardless if it was Biden or Kamala, whoever was going to be in office 2021, whoever that Democrat person would have been, this would have still been an issue. This is something that has been happening over time. As you guys can see, I wanted you to see these charts because I wanted you to see it's a trend that has been happening over time. The pandemic made things, especially worse for people, but this has been a long-standing trend. Christine says, I had to apologize to my daughter because I didn't understand when she was younger. Yeah, and it's one of those things, my parents too, they're boomers and boom hard, and that doesn't sound right, but they're boomers. And my parents were definitely, the type that you got to work hard, save your money, don't spend money on things you don't need, and you can get a home and you can save for down payment. But even my father, a couple of years ago, started to realize what was happening, and he was like, I think I was wrong. I'm like, yeah, that's what he was trying to tell you. Because the prices and the pay, it just doesn't add up, boo. So now you see Morning Joe is now they're pivoting to, let's talk about wealth inequality. Let's talk about these billionaires. But again, now they're starting to call it out because their ratings depend on it. Because the reality is, if you are a show and you are kind of a mouthpiece for the Democratic Party, and the narrative is that the Democrats lost because they didn't have a working class agenda, so they lost the working class, then that means when you decreased in ratings after their election, you lost working class viewers too. So now they're trying to do damage control the same way that the Democratic Party is trying to figure out how to do damage control. I think Morning Joe owes a huge apology to those of us that have been talking about economic populism and the need for this. Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.